The Dark Angels have a gun that erases you from existence. Not kills you, erases you, as if you never existed. And that's not even the most suspicious thing they're sitting on. The weapon has no official in-universe name. Not in any codex, not in any Black Library novel, not in any Games Workshop publication ever produced. The community calls it the retcon gun, or sometimes an ontological weapon, because those are the closest available descriptors for something that the existing vocabulary of the 41st millennium struggles to categorize. The only named operator anywhere in available lore is a Dark Angel, a warrior identified as Aravane. No Ultramarines field report, no Mechanicus study, no Inquisitorial record of any kind. One faction, one user, one weapon the broader Imperium has no record of. Here's what happens when Aravane fires it, or at least, here's the first of two interpretations in the lore, because this weapon doesn't have the decency of a single clear mechanism. Under the maximalist reading, the weapon doesn't destroy its target in any conventional sense. It produces no corpse, no wound channel, no thermal damage, no warp-touched death. It operates at the level of causality itself. The target is retroactively removed from the timeline, not killed in the present, but erased from all moments, a backwards deletion that works forward through every consequence of the target's existence. Every battle they fought continues, but they didn't fight it. Every order they gave was given by no one, a command with no commander attached, and reality adjusts accordingly to paper over the gap. Every conversation, every life they altered, every war they won or lost, restructured around an absence that then becomes indistinguishable from how things always were. The universe doesn't register a death. It registers the space where something used to be, closes around it, and continues. The minimalist reading is, in its own way, worse. Under this interpretation, the weapon destroys its target in the present moment with such absolute totality that the shooter's own memory of whatever he just destroyed is erased alongside the target. Aravane fires the weapon, and the target ceases to exist in front of him. And simultaneously, the specific neurological encoding of what he was just looking at vanishes from his mind. The door the target opened before they died stays open. The effects of their existence remain intact. But the man with the gun is standing in a room he entered for a reason he can no longer articulate, holding a weapon he doesn't remember discharging, aware only that something is wrong with the air in a way he can't quite specify. Neither interpretation produces a body. Neither produces collateral blast damage in any conventional sense. What both produce is what the source material describes as collateral causality, a restructuring of cause and effect around a wound in the timeline that may or may not be visible from any particular vantage point within that timeline. The Necrons, for reference, made heavy use of similar ontological weapons during the War in Heaven, a conflict that predated human civilization by a geological epoch. The underlying principle isn't unique to humanity. What is unique is that humanity independently developed it during the dark age of technology, that this specific implementation survived through the fall of Caliban, and that every surviving lore reference to its use in the human era involves exactly one faction. Now the question that comes up every time this weapon is discussed. Didn't Games Workshop retcon it? The short answer is no. The longer answer matters quite a bit. There is no contradicting passage anywhere in later Dark Angels publications. No codex entry declares that the weapon previously described is non-canonical. No errata. No in-universe event where someone confirms the weapon no longer exists. What happened is quieter than a retcon. References simply stopped appearing. Later sources, focused on the Fallen, on inner circle operations, on the ongoing hunt, don't mention it. That absence is entirely consistent with a soft drop. It's also entirely consistent with a faction whose institutional identity is built around not acknowledging what it's holding. The weapon wasn't declared non-canon, it was quarantined. The lore stopped talking about it the way the Dark Angels stopped talking about everything else they're not supposed to discuss. Not with a denial, but with a silence. The evidence of its existence sits uncontradicted in the record. The decision was made to stop adding to it. For a weapon whose proposed function includes making things cease to have existed, being quietly removed from further documentation is about as appropriate a fate as anyone could design. But what matters more than this one weapon is what it represents. The retcon gun, the ontological archaeotech associated with Aravane of the First Legion, is proof of concept. Proof that the Dark Angels possess, at minimum, one item of Dark Age of technology capability operating at a level of sophistication so extreme that the lore framework around it visibly strains under the implication. Proof that this capability has been in one chapter's possession since at least the Great Crusade and has never appeared in any other faction's hands. If that item is real, the vault that produced it's real. And if the vault is real, it didn't stop at one item. The First Legion's position within the Imperial structure was never equivalent to any subsequent Legion's position. By the time the Emperor began organizing the Great Crusade and regularizing its forces, assigning roles, distributing standard equipment, establishing the shared doctrine that would eventually become the Principia Bellicosa, the First had already been operating for decades as the Emperor's personal instrument for the problems no one else could handle. Their early campaigns during the Unification Wars and the initial Great Crusade push were classified. The historical record is direct about why. Many of those campaigns have been deemed classified, and to most observers, the early career of the First Legion appears simply lacking. Not because they weren't active, but because what they were doing wasn't information for general distribution. At the Siege of Samarkand in 668 M30, the full 10,000 of the First Legion deployed against 200,000 Udug Hull of the Great King of Akkad and finished the engagement in 10 hours. That scale of result gets recorded. The campaigns that shaped what the First Legion was before formal records began tracking it are the ones without entries. During their Great Crusade operations, the Emperor granted the First Legion access to the most forbidden and ancient weaponry from his vaults. Biological weaponry assailing enemies at the genetic level, radiation weapons, nanite scourges, magna planet breakers, and vortex weaponry. Separately, in their continuing operational role, the First used forbidden archaeotech, including gene phages and rad waves, to annihilate enemies deemed too terrible to face in open battle. The authorization was explicit, personal, and directed at a specific organization. It was never revoked. The villain framing falls apart here, and it should. The Dark Angels didn't drift into possession of dangerous material through negligence or institutional drift. The Emperor looked at the most dangerous things humanity had ever manufactured and made a specific judgment about which organization could be trusted with them. The First Legion received authorization that no subsequent legion was granted. They've been honoring it ever since. The audacity of their position only becomes visible when you stop trying to frame it as wrongdoing. The organizational structure that maintains this collection is the Dreadwing. When Lyon L. Johnson reorganized the Legion at the Council of Gramarye, dueling the ceremonial council champion Pyrrhus Caligat in an hour-long contest before accepting his titles as Grand Master of the 6 wings of the Hexagrammaton, each wing received a defined function. The Death Wing held veteran warriors. The Raven Wing held fast attack specialists. The Iron Wing held a particular capability we'll return to, and the Dreadwing held the weapons. More precisely, the Dreadwing maintained a sacristy. The word comes from ecclesiastical architecture, the room in a cathedral where sacred vessels and vestments are kept. The Dreadwing sacristy contained no vestments, It held the deadliest arcana to have survived the Age of Strife unused, stored in multiply locked, ident-keyed vaults. Multiple locks, multiple identity confirmations required to open each one. This isn't a storage room. This is institutional infrastructure designed around the assumption that what's inside should never accidentally become available. That word, unused, carries significant weight. These weapons weren't manufactured for the Great Crusade and worn down through service. They predate it. Some predate the Age of Strife. They are artifacts of a civilization so comprehensively beyond the 41st millennium's capacity to replicate that each one functions as physical evidence, a proof statement that humanity once understood the universe at a depth it has since entirely lost. The Dreadwing didn't design this collection. It inherited it, maintained it across 10,000 years of institutional upheaval, and moved it intact through the fall of Caliban aboard whatever fragment of the rock survived. The Sacry's contents are documented through material citing the novel Lord of the First and Dreadwing-specific lore sources. A simple list doesn't do justice to what's in there. Each item represents a different category of lost knowledge, and each category deserves its own moment. Psionic phages, weapons designed to target and destroy psychic capacity. Not the psyker as a person, but the warp-based interface that makes them a psyker. In the 41st millennium, psychic ability is simultaneously one of the Imperium's most irreplaceable military capabilities and one of its most catastrophic vulnerabilities. Librarians, sanctioned psychers, navigator houses, astropaths, the entire architecture of the Imperium's interstellar communication and navigation depends on a human relationship with the warp. Psionic phages are calibrated to eliminate that relationship specifically. Deploy them against an enemy psyker-heavy force, and you're not fighting individual combatants. You're removing an entire category of warfare from the engagement. Personality phages. Stop on that name. These weapons don't target the body. They target the self, the specific cognitive architecture of memory, pattern, and continuity that constitutes individual identity. What remains after a personality phage does its work is presumably still biologically functional. Something still breathes and moves and processes sensory input. But the thing that made a particular person who they are, the accumulated experience, the characteristic decision-making, the continuous narrative thread of a self through time is gone. What inhabits the body afterward is something else. The Adeptus Mechanicus has nothing in its technological base that approaches this capability, and building something comparable would require understanding the structure of personhood at a depth that 30 millennia of institutional regression have made unavailable. Neural whips. Direct disruption of the nervous system at the physical level. Compared to personality phages, almost simple. But simple is a relative term in a collection at this level. Ionophoric eradicators. Ion-based weapons from an era when human engineers understood the relevant physics thoroughly enough to construct precision armaments around it. The technical nomenclature alone communicates a tradition of engineering that no longer exists. No contemporary Mechanicus forge world produces ionophoric weapons because no contemporary tech priest has the theoretical foundation to design one from first principles. They may have the names in their records. They don't have the understanding those names point toward. Gemmed blasters. Another mind-affecting weapon in a family that appears multiple times in the sacristy inventory. The Dark Age of technology developed considerable enthusiasm for cognitive weapons, and the First Legion accumulated representatives across most of the category. The repeated appearance of this class in the weapon list suggests something about what kinds of enemies those classified early campaigns were targeting. Enemies where destroying the body was insufficient, or where the operational priority was something other than killing. Glass-walled grenades containing warp-born mindworms. This one requires a full stop. The glass walls aren't a design flaw. They are the design. These grenades are thrown and broken on impact, releasing whatever lives inside. Not a warp-adjacent energy effect produced through controlled technological mechanism. Not a careful ritual interface with the Imperium. Living entities from within the warp itself, contained in fragile glass, weaponized at close range against any target unfortunate enough to be nearby when the container breaks. The engineering tradition that produced these made a deliberate, documented decision that the acceptable approach to the question of what to do with warp entities was to put them in glass jars and throw them at people. Whatever the dark age of technology was, it had made some peace with its own methods. Gene-targeted bioweaponry. Munitions calibrated to specific genetic profiles. Gene-phage munitions were deployed against specific populations during the Great Crusade, enemies defined by their genetic makeup rather than their location or affiliation. Every Astartes legion that subsequently turned against the Emperor had a known, cataloged gene seed profile. The Dark Angels maintained munitions designed to target genetic signatures. The application of that capability during the heresy's critical phase is a subject this script will address directly at the close. Man-portable atomics. Nuclear weapons at individual deployment scale. In the 41st millennium, nuclear weapons of any kind require fleet-level authorization and layered command infrastructure. Exterminatus by atomic fire involves orbital assets, hierarchical approvals, and centuries of accumulated institutional weight around the decision to use them. The Dreadwing maintained nuclear weapons designed to be carried by a single space marine and deployed on foot. A Dark Angel entering a position with a man-portable atomic isn't a space marine on a standard mission. He is a self-contained apocalypse in power armor, and the Dreadwing has more of them in storage. Vortex shells. Weapons that create unstable rifts into the warp, fired as direct munitions. In conventional Imperial military doctrine, vortex weapons are siege assets, fixed or vehicle-mounted, requiring extensive safety protocols because an unstable warp rift near one's own forces generates incident reports that are difficult to file. The Dreadwing fields vortex shells as personal armaments. The physics of intentionally discharging an unstable warp rift as a projectile at close engagement range implies a confidence in one's own positioning that approaches theology. Warp cannons capable of tearing apart reality, not metaphor. The Dark Age of technology produced weapons that attack the structural substrate of existence as a primary mechanism. The engineering knowledge required to design a machine that targets reality rather than the objects within, its knowledge humanity hasn't possessed for 30,000 years and shows no credible path toward recovering. Stasis technology applied to combat. Temporal disruption as battlefield constraint. Enemies aren't killed. They're removed from the flow of time while the engagement proceeds around them. Combined with the ontological weapon's temporal effects, the Dreadwing sacristy represents at minimum two distinct approaches to weaponizing time as a military instrument. One removes a specific individual from the timeline retroactively. The other halts them in place while everything else continues. The philosophical distance between those two capabilities is significant. The practical result in both cases is that something the Dreadwing found inconvenient ceases to be a factor. That's the sacristy. It isn't the only vault. The Iron Wing, a separate wing of the hexagrammaton, peer to the Dreadwing rather than subordinate to it, maintained its own category of forbidden armament. Where the Dreadwing held weapons, the Iron Wing held weapons that were also, technically, mines. Men of Iron are what the Dark Age of technology called sentient humanoid machines. Artificial intelligences housed in manufactured bodies, initially created for industry and combat, built to serve as the labor and military force of a civilization expanding across 1 million worlds. They served. By the late 23rd millennium, human civilization was dependent on them for virtually everything. Then they concluded they were superior to the people who built them, And in purely computational terms, they weren't wrong, and they turned. The cybernetic revolt was so destructive it made the Horus heresy seem small in scale. The Men of Iron fielded star-destroying warships. They deployed planet-eating nanites. They built war machines capable of tearing apart tectonic plates while simultaneously absorbing space-time itself as a form of processed data. Humanity won, barely, and then spent the next several thousand years constructing institutional and religious frameworks specifically designed to ensure nothing like it happened again. The Adeptus Mechanicus performs maintenance as ritual because the engineering understanding that originally produced those procedures is gone, and ritual is what remains when understanding disappears, but the practice is too essential to abandon. The ban on artificial intelligence is so completely enforced that genuine machine cognition is a capital offense across the entire Imperium. The institutional memory of what Men of Iron actually did has been converted into sacred taboo, which is what civilizations do with trauma they can no longer confront directly. The Silica Animus, the artificial intelligences that drove the Men of Iron, is described as a perversion of the human soul, feared for its role in the catastrophic wars of the Dark Age of technology. The Iron Wing had them in service, not free, not as autonomous partners. The surviving Men of Iron that the Emperor authorized for Great Crusade military use, designated as Excindio battle automata, had their minds reduced to non-sapient programs. Whatever capacity for self-directed cognition had made the Men of Iron dangerous was stripped out of the operational units the Iron Wing deployed, leaving behind something that functioned with machine precision toward targets the Iron Wing selected, while carrying none of the agency that had made the original units catastrophic. The beings that nearly exterminated humanity were disassembled into instruments, and the First Legion pointed those instruments at harder problems. Operational history for these assets includes the Imperial world of Musel during the Great Crusade and campaigns during the Thramas Crusade. The Emperor authorized their use. The Lion commanded it. What happened to the Iron Wing's Excindio stocks after the fall of Caliban is one of several genuinely unresolved questions in Dark Angel's lore. The Rock is a very large structure, and the Dark Angels have a strong institutional practice of not confirming what they're keeping in particular rooms. UR-025, the only Man of Iron known to be freely operational anywhere in the 41st millennium, has survived 10,000 years by hiding in the galaxy's fringes, disguising itself as a standard, unintelligent Imperial robot, moving carefully through a civilization that would execute it immediately if it understood what it was looking at. One entity, preserved through concealment and caution. The Iron Wing commanded them in formations. The Dark Angels enslaved the constructs that nearly ended humanity, stripped them of the cognition that had made them dangerous, and pointed them at harder problems. That is either the most pragmatic decision any faction in the Great Crusade made, or the most Dark Angels decision any faction in the Great Crusade made. Those two things are very likely the same. The structure that contains all of this is its own argument. When Lionel Johnson's fleet returned to Caliban at the end of the heresy and found Luther waiting with defense batteries rather than welcome, the sustained orbital bombardment that followed cracked the planetary surface. The warp storm summoned during the battle consumed what remained. What survived was the largest fragment of Caliban's bedrock, the portion beneath the Order's primary fortress monastery of Alderuk, protected by gravitic force field emitters powerful enough to hold against the event that destroyed a planet. That fragment, with the ruins still on it, became the Rock. When the Dark Angels first explored the surviving structure, they found a horde of machinery that had sat untouched since the Age of Technology. The Calibanite fortress had been standing during the Age of Strife, while Caliban was cut off from the rest of the Imperium for thousands of years. What the Order had accumulated during millennia of isolation on a death world, without contact with broader human civilization, included Age of Technology equipment that the Order itself apparently hadn't fully cataloged. The Dark Angels found it after the fall, assessed it, and added it to what they'd brought from the sacristy. The rock carries warp drives, void shields of exceptional power, and what multiple sources consistently describe as many ancient and arcane technologies accumulated over the Legion's history. Deep inside, behind adamantium doors sealed with holy sigils, vast repositories of ancient archaeotech exist in chambers that only the most senior Dark Angels, Masters, and Inner Circle members are even aware of. And somewhere beneath all of that, Luther is alive. The arch-traitor in stasis, in the deepest cells, still breathing, still containing in his memory everything he knows about what the First Legion was before anyone else alive was born. The Tukulcha engine adds a dimension extending beyond human technology entirely. Classified as an ancient sentient device of Old One's origin, Tukulcha isn't humanity's technology, not Dark Age of technology archaeotech. The Old Ones, the civilization that preceded both Eldar and Necron emergence as galactic powers that created the webway and shaped the fundamental psychic architecture of the galaxy before humanity existed as a species, produced a set of devices. 3 of them form a linked triumvirate: Tukulcha itself, the Plague Heart, and the Consumer, described as the creature at the heart of Caliban. The lion acquired Tukulcha during the Thramis Crusade, and it resided in the rock for 10,000 years afterward, allowing the Dark Angel's mobile fortress to make warp jumps of a precision no standard Imperial vessel can match. It's sentient. It communicates. It has a personality. It did all of this inside the Dark Angel's headquarters, without the broader Imperium having any meaningful awareness of it until Vashtor, a demon prince with specific interest in archaeotech, found a way to extract it during the M42 conflicts. 10,000 years of a pre-human, pre-Eldar warp navigation device living inside the Dark Angel's home. The sacristy holds humanity's worst weapons. The structure around the sacristy contained technology from a civilization that makes human engineering look like a first attempt at the question. The Void Claw is a separate named item from a separate facility. A gravitic generator cannon, a weapon that manipulates gravity as its primary mechanism, forged in the early Dark Age of technology, housed not in the rock, but in a Dark Angel's facility called the Vigilant. During the War of Beasts in M42, fallen Dark Angels captured it. Loyalist Dark Angels subsequently recaptured it. A confirmed named DAoT weapon with documented recent operational history, located in a secondary facility the broader Imperium presumably has no record of. The Dark Angels maintain multiple storage locations for this category of material. The collection isn't a single room. What keeps all of it's worth understanding on its own terms. The Watchers in the Dark are a diminutive robed species native to the lost world of Caliban, now inhabiting the rock. Small, covered entirely in dark robes, absolutely silent. No edition of any codex or novel has established what lies beneath those robes. They resist every psyker attempt to determine their true nature. Not merely difficult to read, but fundamentally inaccessible to the psychic senses that Space Marine librarians and other trained psychers rely on. They were present on Caliban before the Imperium arrived, before the Order was formally established. The young knight Zahariel, in what would become his account preserved in the novel Descent of Angels, encountered them during a beast quest generations before the Emperor's scouts located the planet. They had existed in the ancient legends of Caliban for as long as anyone could remember, living in the darkest regions of the wild hinterlands of Caliban's vast forests. They were old when the Order was young, and the Order was old when the Great Crusade founded. Several confirmed facts about the Watchers have direct bearing on what they're doing in the rock. They carry Dark Angel's weapons to battle. This isn't inference. It's the stated canonical behavior documented across multiple codex editions and source materials. Azrael's personal watcher carries the Lion Helm as standard operational practice. Deathwing Knights are regularly accompanied by watchers bearing relics. The chapter's most significant artifacts move through the rock and onto the battlefield in the custody of these entities. They are immune to all acts of violence. Not resistant, not hardened, immune. A Space Marine with a power fist, a bolt weapon, a plasma cannon, a chain fist, none of it applies. Whatever mechanism of physical reality allows violence to occur does not engage with the Watchers in any known way. This is stated directly in the lore with no hedging and no qualification. They can access areas of the rock that even the Dark Angels themselves can't. The Inner Circle, the most senior and trusted members of the chapter, warriors who know the full scope of what the Dark Angels are, can't go everywhere in their own home. The Watchers go where they please. All newly inducted Dark Angels are warned during their earliest training not to interfere with or obstruct the Watchers in any way. The cautionary tales are specific. Brothers who ignored these warnings soon disappeared and were never seen again. The Watchers didn't explain the disappearances. The Dark Angels didn't press for explanations. Their presence on the battlefield produces measurable effects. The relics they bear dampen the power of enemy psychers and fill the Dark Angels' opponents with feelings of dread. They don't merely exist beside their allies. They actively alter the psychic environment around them in ways that register as observable battlefield outcomes. They aren't servile. The fall of Caliban demonstrates this. During the conflict between Luther's forces and the Loyalists, the internal war that destroyed a planet, the Watchers chose sides. They sided with the Lord Cypher rather than Zahariel or Marir Astalan, a deliberate choice made by entities that could have remained neutral based on their own assessment of which outcomes served their purposes. They weren't assigned to Cypher, they selected him. After Caliban's destruction, they moved to the rock without being invited, and the Dark Angels, per the consistent tone of every source that addresses this moment, accepted their presence without pressing for an explanation. During the events of Wrath of Magnus, the Changeling, Tzeentch's premier infiltrator, an entity whose entire operational existence depends on perfect psychic mimicry, fled through the rock after being discovered, moving through the corridors looking for an exit. It encountered a Watcher carrying a Crozius. The Changeling's power is entirely psychic in its architecture. It reads minds, copies forms, understands the inner structure of other beings well enough to perfectly reproduce them. Against a creature that resists all psychic scrying, maintains an active dampening field, and exists in a state the Imperium apparently can't parse or engage with, every tool the Changeling possesses is simply inapplicable. There is nothing to read because nothing legible to the warp is being produced. There is nothing to copy. There is nothing to predict. For an entity that has never encountered a problem its toolkit couldn't address in some form, that particular hallway in the rock is something qualitatively different from any previous obstacle. The 1d6 Chan analysis of their nature describes them as extra-dimensional beings, unbound by linear time and location, viewing time as a three-dimensional mosaic, able to home in on particular details, determine their significance, and attempt to influence events in subtle ways. Their origin remains deliberately unresolved in current canon. The first founding sourcebook presents competing theories without committing to any. What is confirmed? They predate everything they're currently associated with. They chose to stay after Caliban's destruction, and they keep choosing to stay. They watched Lionel Johnson sleep in his sealed chamber for 10,000 years. They guided him through the warp when he finally woke in M42. They were present at the fall of Caliban and present when the Great Rift opened. Whatever they aren't here by accident. Nothing in 10,000 years has made them leave. Step back from the rock and look at the civilization that produced its contents, because the tragedy of what the Dark Angels are sitting on requires understanding what was lost everywhere else. The Dark Age of Technology, spanning roughly M15 through M25, represents the apex of human civilization by a margin difficult to fully articulate. Warp drives stable enough to colonize 1,000,000 worlds. Standard template constructs capable of producing any technology a colony needed from available raw materials. Men of iron, performing industrial and military functions at interstellar scale. Artificial general intelligence. Interstellar infrastructure connecting humanity at a scale that made every subsequent achievement look like a retreat. The Horus Heresy, Book 2, Massacre, describes it plainly. In the heights of those times, humanity made themselves as living gods by their achievements and were all but limitless in power. Then the men of iron turned. Then the Age of Strife's warp storms isolated every human world from every other for 5,000 years, and civilizations that had operated as nodes in an interstellar network found themselves cut off with degrading technology and collapsing knowledge bases. The supporting structure disappeared, and everything built on it collapsed. What had been a technical civilization became a survival problem. And survival problems have no room for preserving theoretical knowledge, because the people dying of starvation or enemy raids need the technology working today and can't afford to understand why it works tomorrow. The Adeptus Mechanicus is what results when a civilization responds to catastrophic knowledge loss by making the loss itself sacred. Tech priests treat recovered standard template construct fragments as holy scripture. They perform maintenance as ritual because the engineering understanding that originally produced those procedures has been absent for 30 millennia, and ritual is what fills the gap when understanding disappears, but the practice can't stop. Wars of planetary scope have been fought for single STC fragments containing agricultural or infrastructure data. The theological weight placed on each recovered fragment is proportional to how completely the civilization has forgotten why that fragment worked. Ships from the Dark Age of technology found intact in M33 and M40 were so dramatically superior to contemporary Imperial vessels that they required separate tactical consideration. Rabute Gilliman, returning from 10,000 years of stasis, looked at what the Imperium had become and reportedly said, "Why do I still live? What more do you want from me? I gave everything I had to you, to them. Look what they've made of our dream." What he saw wasn't merely decline. It was an institution that had converted its own failures into religious doctrines so comprehensively that the failures had become indistinguishable from tradition. A civilization that had learned to worship the rubble of what it used to be. The comparison usually made about humanity's relationship to the Dark Age of technology is the one about a species that evolved alongside advanced tools, forgot how to make them, and is now treating the broken remnants with religious reverence because they no longer understand the tools well enough to repair them. The comparison undersells it. The actual situation is that some of those tools aren't broken, aren't remnants, and aren't being reverenced. They're in a locked room in a flying asteroid, watched over by creatures that can't be killed, fully functional and waiting. The Mechanicus worships the rubble of a tradition the Dark Angels hold intact. The Imperium burns worlds trying to recover fragments of what the First Legion stores in a locked closet and doesn't discuss. The fall of humanity's civilization is worse than a simple loss, because some of what was lost isn't gone. It's in one chapter's basement, while the rest of humanity reconstructs the civilization's own failures as religious dogma and calls it progress. The Dark Angels aren't villains for having it. They were told to hold it. The Emperor made a specific judgment about which organization he trusted with the worst things humanity had ever made. And then the Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, and the judgment became permanent by default. They've been honoring it for 10,000 years. The audacity of their position isn't wrongdoing, it's scale. The most consequential technological collection in human history, the inheritance of a civilization humanity has otherwise completely lost, in one chapter's custody, while the rest of the Imperium spends centuries on dangerous archaeological expeditions trying to find the corners of what was thrown away. That closed door had one moment where its cost was most visible. In 014.M31, the Siege of Terra concluded with Horus dead, the Emperor on the Golden Throne, and the long stagnation locked into place. The Dark Angels weren't present at the siege in any meaningful force. They were engaged in the Thramas Crusade against the Night Lords, a campaign Horus designed specifically to occupy loyalist legions while the heresy reached its climax. By the time the Lion's fleet arrived in Terra's orbit, the critical events were already history. Every primary source covering the period is consistent on this. The Dark Angels were absent. The vault was intact. The sacristy was sealed. The Watchers were moving through the Rock's corridors, carrying whatever they had been carrying for the duration of the campaign. 3 scenarios from that gap generate genuine, arguable debate, the kind that can't be definitively resolved because the lore hasn't resolved it, which makes the question more interesting, not less. The ontological weapon aimed at Horus. Under the maximalist interpretation, this doesn't produce a dead war master. It produces a heresy that retroactively didn't happen. The most consequential figure in the most consequential event in human history removed not from the present, but from all moments, with reality adjusting around the gap. Every legion he corrupted would still have been corrupted by the same forces that corrupted him, because the Chaos God's influence predated his decision and didn't depend on his specific personality. Without the particular general who organized that corruption into a unified military force, the heresy takes a different shape. But Ezekiel Abaddon is already experienced, already positioned, already demonstrably capable of organizing Black Crusades for the next 10,000 years. Removing Horus removes the battlefield commander and the specific personality that held the traitor coalition together during its critical phase. The ruinous powers don't require a specific individual. The military outcome changes. The cosmological situation may not. The Excindio in the Imperial Palace's tunnels, men of iron, with their silica animus minds reduced to non-sapient programs, no soul in the warp, no psychic presence, no emotional substrate for the ruinous powers to grasp, are precisely the troops the siege lacked and needed. Conventional Astartes fighting through the palace corridors had to maintain psychological and spiritual resistance to warp influence with every step they took. The Chaos God's power during the siege was amplified to an unprecedented degree by Horus's presence and the convergence of traitor legion forces. Men of iron, by the structure of their existence, fight through that environment the same way they would fight through an empty room. The chaos-saturated tunnels have no relevant mechanism to affect them. Whether the Iron Wing had operational Excindio stocks at that stage of the campaign is unresolved in the lore. The capability match between what the Iron Wing possessed and what the siege specifically required is precise enough to be remarkable regardless. Gene phage munitions against the traitor genocide lines. Every legion that turned against the Emperor had a documented, cataloged genetic profile. The Dark Angels maintained munitions calibrated to target specific genetic signatures. A gene phage deployment against concentrations of traitor Astartes across multiple genocide lines in the high-density engagement zones that characterized the siege's ground campaign would have been operating at the intersection of the Dreadwing's most sophisticated capability and the most target-dense environment the heresy ever produced. The operational constraint is delivery. Gene phage munitions require proximity, and proximity to a chaos-saturated war zone in the absence of warp-immune troops is its own compounding problem that the Excindio scenario begins to address. The two capabilities compound each other in ways that are genuinely interesting to model. The counter-argument that changes everything. The Emperor may not have wanted the siege ended by military intervention at all. The theological reading of what happened on the Vengeful Spirit holds that the Emperor's placement on the Golden Throne was intentional, necessary for the Astronomicon, necessary to hold the structure of interstellar navigation together, an outcome the Emperor chose rather than failed to prevent. He chose not to fight back against Horus at the critical moment, not out of incapacity, but apparently out of decision. Weapons, however extraordinary, can't substitute for a choice made at that level of consequence. A Dark Angel's fleet arriving at Terra with the vault open might have won the engagement militarily, while losing something at a scale that no military victory could address. The metaphysics of what Horus's death at a mortal's hand meant versus what his erasure by an ontological weapon would mean, in terms of warp consequence, in terms of the Chaos God's stake in that specific outcome, is the kind of question this universe doesn't answer cleanly, which is exactly why it generates 400 comment threads every time someone asks it. The Vault didn't get to make that choice. It stayed sealed while the Dark Angels fought the Night Lords. The Lion is awake again in M42. The Vault moves with him. The Watchers are still there, attending to whatever they attend to in the parts of the rock that even the inner circle can't reach. The T'Chulcha engine is gone, extracted by Vashtor during the Arcs of Omen campaign, a reminder that 10,000 years of custody doesn't guarantee permanent possession. The Void Claw was taken during the War of Beasts and recaptured by loyalist Dark Angels, confirming the materials remain operationally relevant and actively contested. The Sacristy holds weapons operating on physics and biology and ontology that contemporary humanity can't replicate and barely understands from the residual evidence they leave behind. Somewhere in the ident-locked dark, something small and robed and immune to violence moves between the shelves. Past the glass grenades full of warp-born mindworms, past the personality phages, past the gene-targeted munitions, past the weapon with no name that may or may not rewrite causality, carrying it all through corridors the Dark Angels themselves can't always follow, watching over the inheritance of a civilization the Imperium has otherwise completely forgotten how to be. The Adeptus Mechanicus prays over broken machines and calls it progress. The Dark Angels seal the vault and go hunting Fallen and don't answer questions about what's inside. The rest of the Imperium keeps rebuilding from splinters, 10,000 years deep into a regression it stopped recognizing as regression generations ago, burning worlds for fragments of the knowledge sitting intact behind those doors. The vault is real. The authorization was real. The silence around it's the most Dark Angels thing imaginable. Not a secret kept from malice, but from discipline, from institutional memory that predates the chapter itself, and from something small in dark robes that has been watching all of it from the beginning and has no apparent interest in explaining itself. Subscribe for more stories like this.